Hello everybody, welcome to another English 370 class. Today we've got a pretty fun topic on the schedule. We're finishing up our adventure through historical linguistics. This is essentially historical linguistics part 3. We also talked about them in our in-person class on Friday. And what we did there is, so we're going to be finishing that off, ramping up, rounding out, all that kind of fun stuff. In Friday's class, what we got a chance to do is take a look at what we're going to call the comparative method. And it's a methodology that historical linguistics has come up with as a way of recreating proto-languages. Proto-languages, again, for a quick recap, are languages that are spoken languages. They're natural languages, just like any other language, like English or Chinese or Arabic or French or whatever else. The only difference is we don't have any written record of them. So these are languages, real languages that were spoken in the past that we can infer the existence of based on the synchronous, the modern similarities we see in languages today. We work back towards that ancestor language, but it's a proto-language because we don't have written records for it. We'll talk about that distinction a little bit later on as well after we talk about the comparative method. So we saw a hands-on example from this East Central Papuan language family here where we had 3 languages, you'll remember. We had Aroma, Hula, and Sinagoro. We saw that they're very similar. And we created these correspondent sets. Some of them were easy, right? Oh, you can't see my... Now you can see my mouse. Some of them were easy, these correspondent sets. And again, what this is saying is that P in aroma corresponds to a P in hula, corresponds to a P in Sinagoro. And you see that right here, right? Pune, pune, pune. Opi, kopi, kopi. P's in all 3 languages. So this is our correspondence set for which we're going to decide on a certain phoneme to correspond with these languages from the proto-language. These are the daughter phonemes, you can think of it that way. We want the parent phoneme. And in very simple cases, it's very obvious, very easy. When you have 3 things, all are the exact same. This is called the identity case. We're just going to recreate the P here. We got a little bit harder, right? And then we looked at this kind of stuff where we had a PPB, and we started to get these rules interacting. Not rules, these... What's a good way to phrase this? These different ideas in historical linguistics. One of them was majority wins, right? So you choose the easier route. And saying recreating P here is easier because there's multiple P's and there's only one B. But we had another sort of idea, another sort of mini rule, if you want to think of them that way, that says for each correspondence set you need a different proto-phoneme. A different modern realization of every proto-phoneme, just to reverse that equation. So the idea here being is that although we would want P to be the proto-phoneme for this set because majority wins, we actually can't choose P to be the proto-phoneme because we already chose P for this correspondence set. A key factor here is that although this correspondence set, PPP, looks very similar to this correspondence set, PPB, they're in fact different. These are different correspondence sets, therefore they need different proto-phonemes. We definitely want P for this one, so we're stuck choosing B in this one. Which is fine, So these are good things to remember. Start out with majority rules. Then we have some bonus rules like you need each correspondence set needs its own proto-phoneme. They can't share proto-phonemes. Yeah. Another rule we learned, if you remember from Friday's class, we were looking at this example and we decided that again, majority rules should be null, but we're going to recreate the T. And the sub rule that's coming into play here is that it's easier to do insertion. It's easier to do deletion than it is to do insertion. So if we posit a proto-phoneme T, in order to get to these nulls, we just needed to do a deletion, which is very easy. if we did it the other way around and posit a null phoneme, we instead have more work to do in the form of an insertion. Null goes to T is a harder rule than just T disappears. Anyway, watch Friday's lecture again if you need a recap of that segment. What we ended up with is a bunch of proto-phonemes for the ancestor to these languages. Proto-Aroma Hula Sinagoro. Proto-East Central Papuan, if you want to call it that. So we have a bunch of proto-phonemes, one per each correspondence set. A kind of cool thing that this lets us do is that this lets us recreate not just the phonemes of this proto-language, but actually the words themselves as well. Excuse me. Right? So we can say that since we recreated the proto-phoneme K here, and we recreated the proto-phoneme O here, and P, and the E, letter I, we know that the proto-form of the word for skin in these languages must have been Kopi. Okay, it looks like these daughter languages, but it doesn't look like this daughter language. So we know that the proto-word, again, for skin was Kopi. That's pretty cool. And again, we know the proto-word for father is actually Tama and not Ama. Cool. Now, we can make rules on how to get from the proto-language that we were just recreated to these daughter languages. And this is going to look a lot like a phonology problem from earlier in the semester. So for example, we need these rules to derive the modern forms from the recreated proto-forms that we just made. So we're going to have to say that B goes to P, the proto-phoneme P goes to P and aroma and hula, right? That's for this set. When we recreate this B right here, we need to say B goes to P. B goes to P for aroma and hula, but not Sinagoro. Sinagoro keeps the B, right? So we have this set of rules. This is changes that have happened over time in this proto-language that have changed it into these three separate languages, aroma, hula, and Sinagoro. Rewind this part if it's not making sense. I'm going through a lot of information quickly here. So now, a question we want to ask about this language family that we were just looking at, aroma, hula, and Sinagoro, is which languages are more closely related than others? Are there sub-branches, or is it a flat structure? Think of our syntax trees. Are all of these equally similar, or are there some that maybe we want to say form a subfamily? And there are, right? What we actually want to end up recreating is this. This is a tree here, right, where this is the proto-language, Proto-East Central Papuan. And we want to say it's got three modern languages here that we've seen, aroma, hula, and Sinagoro, but that these two, aroma and hula, are more closely related to each other than either of them are to Sinagoro, which is kind of the, black sheep of the family over here, hanging out, right? We can see this relatively easily by just looking at the data, right? Ama, ama, tama, right? Ama and ama are identical, aroma and hula are looking very similar, and Sinagoro is different. La, la, lata. Again, these two pattern in a way, and this one's the odd man out. Upu, upu, tubu, right? So we can see that and that's kind of like our intuitions are telling us that. But we don't want to just rely on our intuitions. We want to have a more formal way to create these family trees than just, well, they look similar. And the way we do that, the way we form these family trees, is by using this list of rules. This list of rules is incredibly important to how we create the family tree. It dictates it. It dictates it to us. And how do we use this? set of rules to get to this family tree? Well, it works like this. Here we see a change that has happened. B goes to P and aroma and hula. Think about our phonology rules and wanting to make them as easy as possible. Right? So we could say that this rule happens twice. That it goes from the proto-language, when it goes from the proto-language to aroma, B goes to P. And when it goes from the proto-language to hula, P goes to B, right? But it's a simpler solution for us if instead we say that this change, B to P, only happened once. Only happened once. And it happened sort of right here in this branch, right? So when we went from Proto-East Central Papuan to Proto-Aroma Hula, we changed the P's to B's one time. One time in history did that happen. And then the B having language, the B-less languages, because we lost B, right? B to P. The B-less languages, Aroma and Hula, separated from each other. But at this point, they had already lost their B's because that happened up here. So we can say that although you see this change into modern languages, Aroma and Hula, it actually happened to their shared ancestor, Proto-Aroma Hula. That's where this B to P change happened. During this line, this one line, not here and here. It happened up here, right? And so that these shared changes, aroma and hula, share this change P to B, B to P, difficult talking today, this sharing of phonological change over time is in fact what binds them together more closely than Sinagoro, right? B went to P for Proto-Aroma Hula, but it didn't do that in Sinagoro. That's why we lump these together. And we see the exact same thing happening for the loss of T. T goes to null. That happened also up here. Not down here and down here. It only happened one time. This one, K goes to null, is something that happened down here, also just one time. That's what separates aroma and hula. All right? That's important. An important distinction here is that it's the changes, the shared changes, that are determining what languages are most closely related. It's the shared innovations. It's not shared retention. It's not shared retention. It's the shared innovation. So for instance, if we look here, hula in Sinagoro, both have this K present. Hula and Sinagoro have this K present. So now we're looking at this one. K and K. And aroma looks different. Aroma looks different. So on the surface, our intuitions would be that hula and Sinagoro are more closely related than they are to aroma. We should put hula and Sinagoro together in a nice little family tree and leave aroma out. Take that aroma. But that's not the case. There's a subtle difference here. There's a subtle difference here. Right. This looks like what we said for this ama tama, but it's actually different. It's actually different. And the difference between these two sets is that here, for the T and nothing set, we're recreating the T in Sinagoro. So T goes to nothing, that rule, is shared by aroma and hula. It's a shared change, shared innovation. These languages innovated the I'm not going to have a T. They did that together, and they did that together, like we said, right here. That's for this T to nothing change. Now let's look again at that K change, right? Here, what we did is we recreated a K. That means only one change happened. decay goes to nothing in aroma. That's the change. So here, remember that we make family trees based on shared innovation. This is not a shared innovation. Aroma is the only one that changed. Nobody changed with it. It doesn't share this innovation with anything. Instead, there's shared retention. These two languages just happen to have inherited what the proto-phoneme had. That doesn't give them any credit. That doesn't make them more closely related. I mean, it makes them related, right? Because at some point, all of these languages are related. But it doesn't put them in a subfamily. Okay, you got to watch this video carefully here, because this is an important and subtle point, and it's important, A. This is a three-part plan. Part 1, it's important. Part 2, it's subtle. Part 3, I forgot to make a slide for it. It means you have to take notes on this. This is valid material for your test, as is everything that I say, of course. But here, write this down. Subfamilies are determined by shared changes, not by shared retentions. What determines the difference between an innovation, a change, and a retention? What we choose to recreate for the proto-language. What we choose to recreate is what determines a shared innovation from a shared retention. Whew! We spent more time on that than I thought, but it's, again, important and subtle, and I forgot to make a slide for it. So rewind if that doesn't make sense. Or send me an email, or ask me on Friday, or something else. Let's keep moving. How long have I been on here? Not too bad. We're doing all right. Okay, so that's cool. That's cool. I'm going to stop talking about the comparative method, the nitty-gritty of it right now, and instead I'm going to talk about some other things. First of all, a question that I want to address. A good question that I hope some of you have thought and probably not bothered to ask, which is fine, but you can always ask me this kind of question, is like, hey, does this actually work? And what's the evidence for it, right? We're talking about these languages that have been spoken, 6,000, 7,000 years ago? How do we know? Does it work, and how do we know? Great questions. Glad you asked, hypothetical class. Turns out it's pretty good. Question number 1, does it work? Yeah, it actually works. Question number 2, how do we know? Well, we have some cases where we can use a test case, right? So a really good, easy example of this is Vulgar Latin. This is Latin that was spoken by the people, right? It's not vulgar in the sense that it's inappropriate. It's vulgar in the sense that it's spoken by common people rather than highfalutin Latin. This is what was spoken all over Europe when the Roman Empire was ruling, and after for a period as well. Vulgar Latin is an ancestor language. Is it a proto-language, class? Is Vulgar Latin a proto-language? No. It's not a proto-language because we have written evidence for it. Remember that that's the distinction. We have actually plenty of writings of people writing in Vulgar Latin. But it is an ancestor language, and it has many descendants. What are the descendants of Vulgar Latin? Romance languages. All of the Romance languages, right? French and Spanish and Portuguese and Italian and Romanian. All of these Romance languages are descended from Vulgar Latin. So we can do a cool experiment where we take our methodology, right? We take the comparative method and we look at these Romance languages. And we pretend for a second, we cover our eyes and pretend that we don't have writings from Vulgar Latin. No, but we just close our eyes again. We don't look at Vulgar Latin, we only look at the modern daughter languages of Vulgar Latin, the Romance languages. And we use our methodology. We say, using only the comparative method, could we work our way back? If we do this method, we work our way back to their ancestor. What does it look like? It should look like Vulgar Latin. That's the idea, right? And this is a nice check case because, again, we can do this experiment, use the comparative method, come up with an ancestor to these Romance languages, and then compare it to Vulgar Latin and see how close we are. It's a test case for our methodology. And it turns out if you do this, you get very, very close to Vulgar Latin, right? It actually works. The methodology works. You do the thing, and then you compare what we got from the comparative method versus what we should have gotten given history, and they're really, really close, right? This is proof of our methodology, right? And you say things like, oh yeah, that word for tooth, this really was dente, right? That's what I thought all along. It's a cool case. It's a cool case. It's not the only case, though, right? There are some other things, other places we can look, right? So here's a bunch of Germanic cognates. We saw some of these earlier. These are languages like Dutch, German, English, Swedish, Icelandic. This is the Proto-Germanic family tree. So Proto-Germanic is this language. It's, I think, this one. This is like in Dutch or something, now that I look at it. Anyway, Proto-Germanic is a proto-language. There's no written evidence for it. Remember, that's what it means again. And it's a daughter of Indo-European. It itself, Indo-European's so old, its daughters are also proto-languages. Yeah. And so we can look at this proto-language and see if we can recreate it from its modern languages, right? Like Swedish and Norwegian and Dutch and Afrikaans, etc. This language was spoken about 2,000 years ago, and we don't have any surviving text, like I said, but we can compare our recreations then not to Proto-Germanic itself, but to early Gothic, like a really old version. We basically go back as far as we can. Some early Scandinavian runic inscriptions also come pretty close. So we compare our reconstructions to these sorts of things. We have evidence from various sources. Here's the Codex Argentis, the Silver Bible from about the 6th century. And we compare our recreations to this, and we find that we get pretty close. Other cool ones, it's just good to see where this data comes from. Like, what are we comparing against? Check out this killer stone. There's a rune stone here. This is in Old Norse, and it says, these awesome adventures, right? And this is commemorates in memory of her son Haraldar, Ingvar's brother, and they traveled valiantly far for gold, and in the east gave food to the eagle. They died in the south in Sarkland in Arabia, right? This cool passage between Scandinavia and Arabia that existed back then. Fascinating. Anyhow, linguistically interesting because it gives us something further back that we compare our methodology to. Pretty sweet. Pretty sweet stuff. Okay, yeah. So this works for things like Vulgar Latin and probably even for Proto-Germanic 2,000 years ago, but how do we get even close to Proto-Indo-European, right? Who weren't writing, we can't check their writings. So are we just guessing about that it works for this far back? And the answer is basically, yeah, we're just guessing. But we have pretty good evidence. We have, like we said, we can look at places like Vulgar Latin and other language families from around the world to see that our methodology works and that we're at least reasonably close. Do we think that our reconstruction of Proto-Indo-European is exactly what people were speaking 6,000 years ago? No. But we hope that we're close. We hope that we're close. Okay, now it's story time. We're going to probably end with a little historical linguistics tale here. And it's a tale of the success of the comparative method, the success of historical linguists and linguistics in a really cool way. It's a story of Saussure, Ferdinand De Saussure. So back in the day, 1800s, that is, that's the day. It's a very good day, the 1800s. Historical linguists were looking at Proto-Indo-European, and they were looking at these vowels, 3 vowels in particular, right? There's this schwa and this A and O. We'll reference these as A and O. And they saw that these things varied with each other and that they varied systematically. It looked like. Pretty systematically did these vowels vary. And what do you want to do with systematic vowels that exist in complementary distribution, class? It's on the screen and in your minds, both. So you have no excuse for not knowing it. They wanted to say these were allophones, given their pretty much complementary distribution, but they had problems with this. Right? It looked like normal ablaut, whatever. The trouble was that there were minimal pairs. It wasn't truly complementary distribution. Right? There was some contrastive distribution, and people said, "Blast! Foiled again!" Blamed it on meddling kids, scratched their heads, talked about it at dinner parties, etc. And they were stuck recreating these phonemes. These three different phonemes, when they really only wanted to do one, but they were good scientists and couldn't give in to whims, so they had to recreate these things. Okay, now enter the hero of our story, Ferdinand de Saussure. Remember Saussure? What did we associate with Saussure earlier in the semester? The very beginning of the semester, like week 1? We talked about him with regards to this arbitrariness of the signifier and the signified. Right? He talked about signs a lot. And this arbitrariness of the signifier and the signified was really important. Right? That's Saussure, the same guy we're talking about. But now he's not talking about that anymore. Now he has his historical linguistics cap on. And what he said is that there really is only one vowel there. It really is complementary distribution. But we're missing something. We're missing something. His claim was that there must have been some sort of phonetic component that appeared after these vowels, right? So it was like schwa something, a something, o something, and that something must have been conditioning these vowels. So that when you get something number 1, you get an A, and you get something number 2 following it, you get an O, and if maybe there's no something, then it's a schwa. Right? That we're missing something. The problem with this something that Saussure posited was that there's no evidence for it. Like, none. No evidence, right? Indo-European is this huge family, and it's got tons of daughter languages. Tons, right? We're talking anything from Hindi to Russian to English. Big family, lots of daughter languages, and none of these daughter languages had Saussure's something. None of them had it. But he said it must exist. He called these somethings coefficients sonantiques. I don't speak French. So, the story, kind of ends for Saussure there, unfortunately, because Saussure dies. As people do, right? I shouldn't laugh at his misfortune, although I don't actually know how he died. I don't know how unfortunate it was. But anyway, this happened. And now the story continues later. We have Hittite. It's actually being discovered while Saussure is still alive, but he's not really aware of it. Anyway, it was discovered and deciphered in the early 20th century. It's this really cool, really old language written in this cool cuneiform script that you can see on the screen here. It's Hittite. It's a cool language. Google it sometime. And when they deciphered this language, they found that it was actually an Indo-European language. How cool is that, right? This long-lost language that gets deciphered fits into our puzzle of Indo-European. And what they found in this, I'm missing a slide here apparently, but what they found in this language, Hittite, which is Indo-European, there's ample evidence. It's very obvious if you look at those correspondences, right? Recurring correspondences in basic vocabulary, just like we were told by Erasmus Rask. Except there's something different about Hittite. Something different. There's something in Hittite that none of the other Indo-European languages have. It's got this weird consonant. A strange consonant that only appears in certain places. Any guesses to where this mysterious consonant occurred in Hittite, an Indo-European language? It appeared exactly where Saussure predicted there must be something. Right? Saussure said there must be some sort of phonetic material following these vowels and we just can't see it. Well, in Hittite you can see it. Right? Coefficients sonantiques, right? Hittite has them. Hittite had exactly what Saussure predicted we would find based on things like the comparative method and good historical linguistics, internal reconstruction, that kind of thing. Things we won't get into in this class. But how cool is that, right? Like this is a cool story of historical linguistic successes. Saussure, using the methodologies developed by historical linguists, predicted that we were missing something. And then, just by happenstance, right, we find these old tablets with Hittite that allows us to decipher them and confirm exactly what Saussure predicted we would find. Right? It's not very often in life that you dig up old tablets that prove you right. So you gotta revel in it a little bit when that does happen, right? Take your shots when you can get them. Like I said, unfortunately, by the time this was discovered, Saussure had already passed away, but I'm sure he knows about it. Somebody told him. Right. And so that's basically the evidence that I'm going to present to you for the comparative method. If you need more evidence, let's talk. There's more evidence. And we can talk too, I wanted to mention briefly, we've been talking a ton about Indo-European in this class. That's not because English happens to be Indo-European. I don't really care about that. But a lot of this the methodology was developed essentially to work on Indo-European. Right? So what we care about more is the methodology. Proto-Indo-European is just sort of the poster child test case. But there's been a lot of work done in other language families as well, using the exact same methodology, right? This methodology is not limited to this language family. Somebody asked about this in Friday. How many language families are there, right? A lot. There's a lot of different language families and we've recreated proto-languages using this comparative work. Edward Sapir, who we've also talked about in this class and we'll talk about in a couple weeks' time with the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, looked at a lot of American Indian languages. There's also been a lot of work in Southeast Asia, things like also in other European language families like Finno-Ugric, Polynesian language families, a ton of stuff, right? Here's just a few examples that show you what that looks like, right? Here's a Proto-Eskimo Aleut with its daughter languages, Yupik, Natsivik, and Nunavik. And you can see the similarities here. Right, this might be a little bit harder to see than our Indo-European ones where you have some common ground, but we can still nonetheless see, right, things like this, looks like this, looks like this. We could start to pull out even correspondences here, right? Like we might say that this hla L corresponds to this, corresponds to these L's. Yep, cool. The K might correspond to these Q, that's a uvular. And the same methodology. So there's a bunch of different language families. We were just talking about Indo-European because it's kind of the most storied example. Another question was asked in one of the sections on Friday that was really, maybe a question wasn't asked, but we started talking about it anyway. Maybe it was a tangent. These things happen. About like how many language families are there and is it possible how far back can we go, right? So Proto-Indo-European, again, 6-ish thousand years ago. Like, can we go further back than that? Could we theoretically connect all of the world's language families into one big proto-language, right? Proto-world, this has been called. The question is, like, how far back can we go? And people have been asking this question for a long time, right? People have been trying to recreate one single proto-language, one language to rule them all, one language to find them. And this can often be ideologically charged or not. It doesn't really matter. People have been doing this forever. And they use examples like this. So we'll spend just a minute talking about this example before we end class for the day. So they're looking at a bunch of different language families here, right? Indo-European, Basque, Finno-Ugric, Dravidian languages in southern India, Algonquian languages in native North America, Mande languages, Kordofanian, Nilo-Saharan, Chadic, right? A lot of African languages from all over the world. And they are looking at these things and noting similarities, just like we did with Greek and Sanskrit and Latin. They're noting similarities, saying things like, here, well, in Latin, the word for mind is mens, right? And in Basque, it's brains is munak, and in Tumali, a Kordofanian language, think is aiman. They all have these M's and N's, right? Essentially, they're looking at these M's and N's things. Moni, Monavi, Menwe, Me, it doesn't have the N. Ma doesn't have the N. Min for wish. So there's phonetic similarities here. And they're all kind of these cerebral-ish activities. And so looking at all these, we can recreate, just like we did making correspondent sets, something like MENA, right? For proto-world to think. Put on your skeptic hats, class. It's okay. Your skeptic hats are more than allowed here, right? In what ways might we be skeptical of this data? Does this convince you? Does this convince you? I hope not. I hope not. This should not convince you. Does this intrigue you? Okay, sure, you can be intrigued. I will allow your intrigue, but I hope not to allow you being convinced. And I want you to think why we shouldn't be convinced by this. Because again, spoilers, we shouldn't be convinced by this. And there's several reasons. One, we could take issue with this particular example, for instance, and say like, well, what does this mean, right? Like, how did you reconstruct this to think? We've got things as different as prefer and prayer and say and wish and mind, right? Like, these semantically are such a wide category, right? Like they're not particularly, they don't all mean to think or even close. Like if it was mind and brains, I'd be in on it. But the fact that it's also say and prayer and wish, like, no, I'm not in on it anymore. Count me out, right? Count me out. So the example, even this example's weak, but there's a bigger issue here. There's a bigger issue here that I have taught you 2 classes ago. Maybe 1 class ago. I forget when I actually got over this. But what else? What else is the problem with this? What do we need to say languages are related? We have very specific instructions about what we need in order to say languages are related, which is what people are trying to do here. Recurring correspondences in basic vocabulary. Recurring correspondences in basic vocabulary. Ignoring for the minute whether or not this is basic vocabulary, it's probably close enough. We need recurring examples of this. We need to see this again and again and again and again, and we only see one example. Is it that Ross is withholding from you the other examples? No, it's that there isn't that many examples. There aren't. We just don't have enough data to get recurring occurrences, right? Recurring correspondences. So therefore, be skeptical. That being said, does this mean that there definitively is not a proto-world and that these languages are in fact unrelated? Doesn't mean that either. It just means that we don't have evidence. This could be the case. This could be totally accurate. This could be the start of something promising and awesome. And if we had all the data, maybe we'd see it, but we don't. And practically what that means is that there's a limit to our methodology. Right? Given the data that we have, we actually can't go back indefinitely. We can only go back so far. And it looks like, according to our best guesses, that the so far is something like 6,000 years, 10,000 years, somewhere in there. That's a pretty big gap. It's a pretty big range, but it looks like Proto-Indo-European's about as old as we're going to get. Barring any breakthroughs, barring any mysterious tablets showing up and proving our coefficients son antiques posthumously, that's about what we got. All right, class. Hopefully I've convinced you that historical linguistics is the coolest and that you should all be mini Saussures in your future lives moving forward. And if not, that's okay too. I have a few more things in historical linguistics that we can talk about that are kind of interesting and kind of fun. So if you're feeling passionate about this, go ahead and send me an email, and we have a little wiggle room about what we talk about. Otherwise, we're going to jump into our next topic. This is a reasonably good stopping point. So we'll see. We'll see what happens on Friday. It'll be a surprise, even to me. Until then, hope you guys are doing well. Hope you had a great weekend, and I will see you again on Wednesday for another recorded lecture on YouTube. So until then, dream of coefficients son antiques, and have a good day.